I'm Giltaca, CEO and Executive Director of the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights, also known as the CCFR. With me today is our Vice President of Public Relations, Tracey Wilson. We're here to talk about two things: our opposition to the Liberal NDP government's Bill C-21 and the results of our legal case CCFR versus Canada. So last week, during Senate testimony, we heard an official from Public Safety reveal that the Liberal government's Bill C-21 would effectively end ownership of handguns in Canada in around 50 years. They had an actual number. And that will be done by confiscating with no compensation legally acquired handguns from the widows and family members of gun owners as they die. That is the targeted destruction of an entire culture involving 650,000 Canadians, including 450,000 who are actively involved. A community built over generations in this country, and that was something pretty extraordinary to hear. Now, some might wonder, well, how do you justify something like this? The government should have to justify something like that, but we'll come back to that. The Toronto Police Service tells us that 97% of actual crime guns, now that's important, actual crime guns, come from the United States. And that came from Inspector Norm Proctor from their Guns and Gangs unit. He held a press conference, actually, to tell us all about that. That's very important. So the Liberals are telling us that to address that 3%, at least in this case, to be fair, that we are all okay with the loss of, I don't know, half of the 1,400 shooting clubs across the country, so 700, maybe more clubs, billions in real estate acquired, developed, and maintained by millions of gun owners over generations, using their after-tax money, I might add. And do we know what the value of that is? Was that at all considered in the government's 50-year analysis? The Conference Board of Canada tells us that destroying sports shooting in Canada will cost the economy somewhere around $2 billion annually. Now add in a few billion in legally purchased handguns and equipment, again, just simply taken from Canadians. And the Liberals are apparently okay with the generational anger that will result in a Canada that has never been more divided than it is right now. But I think the big question is, maybe these things are worth it, right? We're talking about public safety here. But for that to be true, have the RCMP or the Firearms Program or the Liberals or the NDP or the Bloc, have they shown us any evidence that criminals won't be able to make up that 3% of handguns that they're apparently getting from the legal market? Might criminals just increase their smuggling operations? They have plenty of money. Maybe they'll fly a few more handguns across the border on drones. They've been doing that recently. Or maybe they'll just ramp up their manufacturing operations. That is literally easy for them to do. So the question is, what assurances has the government or the RCMP given us that these criminals can't make up that 3% of guns any other way? I haven't seen anything to that effect, but maybe I'm missing something. So the takeaway here is that the government has a real evidence problem. The government has a real credibility problem on this issue. So we felt it was important that Canadians consider the side of the issue that they hear very little of. Now, I want to add this just before I hand it over to Ms. Wilson. I want to give you a real-world example of how the handgun ban portion of Bill C-21 works, okay, what the Liberals are actually doing here. So I'm a cancer survivor, well, at least for now, and my daughter has a restricted firearms license, like I do, which is what you needed to own handguns. If I end up losing my battle with cancer, let's say, the RCMP will be at my door, likely immediately after my death, and they will confiscate about $20,000 of property, and they'll just take it, instead of my daughter rightly inheriting those firearms and using them for herself, and keeping this part of her life and mine. Instead of that, the government will just take it and give her nothing. So even though she's completely qualified by the same standard that I am to own these firearms, they will be seized and destroyed. And the question's why? Because gang members are shooting each other in downtown Toronto and downtown Vancouver with smuggled handguns from the United States, and because the Liberal NDP government has been completely either unwilling or unable to do anything about it. Apparently that's why. And this is important too. and I'd like Canadians to think about this. Is it so shocking? Is it so bewildering that gun owners are angry about this? Is it so hard to understand? Even community groups in at-risk communities don't believe that this bill is going to do anything to address the violence that they see every day. Even they know this ban is worthless. So anyway, I'd like to hand it over to Ms. Wilson to make a few comments regarding the results of our court case.
Thank you, Rod. As some of you know, the CCFR launched a very important judicial review of the government's use of an order in council to ban 1,550 models of firearms back on May 1st, 2020. An additional 700 models of firearms have since been reclassified to prohibited by the RCMP. The CCFR held that the government did not possess the administrative authority it needed to do this, as there are limitations found in the Criminal Code of Canada to banning certain firearms. Canadians have owned these firearms legally, safely, and without issue for decades. Justice Kane of the federal court disagreed with the CCFR, and how we interpret her findings in plain language is the court seems to agree with the government that it can take whatever it wants, whenever it wants, from whomever it wants without justification. Justice Kane apparently accepts that the RCMP can reclassify firearms and tell nobody. This should be an alarming confirmation that Canadians have no property rights. There's nothing you can own that a current government can just take away from you. Can't just take away from you. It seems, as gleefully declared by Elizabeth May in the House of Commons a couple of years ago, Canadians have no property rights at all. Having reviewed the federal court's decision, the CCFR has decided to appeal on the basis that Justice Kane erred in her interpretation and application of the law. Our legal team will be filing an appeal shortly. The CCFR promised gun owners and all Canadians that we'd see this thing through to the end and we'd fight it with everything we can, and we meant it. While a political solution is inevitable, for now the courts are our battle space. We're happy to take your questions.
Thanks for Rod. Hi there. Thanks for making yourself available today. What do you see as I listened to your testimony today in committee as well. What do you see as your biggest concern with C21 as it stands right now?
Well, our biggest concern is the handgun ban, because not only is it taking the guns away from everyone that's not shooting anyone, but it's doing that without compensation. So for us, it's the same as someone coming in and saying, you know what, there's too much drinking and driving happening. I'm sorry, we're going to take your car. And you would say, well, wouldn't you have to prove that taking my car will reduce drinking and driving first? And the government, in this case, is saying, we don't have to prove anything. And so is the court. So that's a really big issue for us.
With the way that with C21 right now, is there anything in this bill that you do support, that you would get behind? Yeah,
we do. We support any measure in any bill that increases public safety and directly addresses violence, because, yeah, there is violence in Canada. And it's funny because, you know, we get painted as a gun lobby like we're, you know, pro-criminal or something like that. At the end of the day, we want a safer Canada too. So when it comes to things like, and I'll give you an example, so the red flag provisions, there's a lot of controversy, especially from women's groups, that the red flag provisions are not a good fit. But for me, oddly enough, I'm thinking, well, anything that can address, especially domestic violence, we're in favor of that. But we cautioned the Senate that it is their job, and it's incumbent on the government to figure out how you're going to increase the ability of the government or other people in the community to take firearms away from people that ought not have them, but at the same time make sure that a system like that isn't ripe for abuse. Because people like gun owners, people like me and Ms. Wilson, we're the ones that will face those shortcomings of the bill. So someone could anonymously call the police and say, well, Rod was waving a gun in the air and I think he might be threatening his wife. And then ERT, is going to show up at my door and search my home and take my guns, and then I have no ability to be like, well, wait a minute, why would you even think this is actually true? So that's a concern. So our concerns are, we need to make the best legislation that we possibly can that strikes the right balance between the interests of public safety and not victimizing people that have done nothing to deserve it.
I just want to make sure I have clarity on what you're saying there. You mentioned the red flag provision, so do you support that part of Bill C-21?
Well, it's hard because I'm not an expert in domestic violence or anything like that, right? So I can't offer a lot. But I will say that red flag provisions have existed in Canada for 35 years. It's part of the Firearms Act. So if you had a public safety concern, you need only call the RCMP. The RCMP, depending on if there are exigent circumstances, can go to anyone's door and take anyone's guns away at any time if they believe that there's a real problem. So can a court. So it's, I wish I could offer more, but I can't really.
This was a question that was asked to the hunting groups earlier on in their testimony, and I don't think it was asked of your group. Do you believe that any type of gun should be banned in Canada?
Well, I think overall, we believe as a group that there should be vetting. There should be a regulatory system around firearms, because you can't just have anyone pick up a firearm. There is inherent danger for misuse. So in Canada, we have a list as long as an entire page of text, which details what you need to do to own a handgun, for example. And we're okay with regulation as long as it makes sense. We're not okay with regulation that is there just to be a punitive measure against people that typically wouldn't vote for the Liberal or the NDP. And those things like that, those things can be vetted out if we were able to have a fact-based, mutually a respectful conversation in Canada about these issues.
So you're in favor of regulation, but to go back to my question, is there any gun that you think should not be banned?
Well, it depends on the type of firearm. So if you're talking about full automatic, true assault weapons, the movie industry in Canada has those kinds of firearms. Law enforcement has them. The government has them. So if there's, I don't know, what would an example be? Maybe a collector or whatever, with the proper licensing and the proper regulation, then I don't think that that's a threat to public safety. Just like I don't think that private handgun ownership is a threat to public safety because of the vetting system and the regulatory system we have around it.
So I should clarify that. Do you think that there should be any gun for private ownership that should be banned?
Well, it depends what the purpose is. So for regular semi-automatic rifles, like the ones that were banned and back in May 2020, those are just rifles just like any other rifle that isn't banned today. There's no difference in those. Those should not be banned at all. So, the firearms that we've been talking about for 3.5 years, no, they should be available. Should someone meet the minimum requirement of training, which is a requirement in Canada. We have a criminal record check every 24 hours. AR-15s were registered, handguns are registered, that's all okay. So if you can meet those requirements, there's no reason why you shouldn't own those firearms.
I won't keep you for much longer, but I'll ask you one more question, which is, people who advocate for Bill C-21 say that this is a way to improve public safety. Why do you think that is not the case, and what would you suggest otherwise?
Well, that's a big question, right? And it's funny because I can tell you why a handgun ban won't enhance public safety. I think I've laid that out completely clearly and well enough for anyone to understand it, whether they know anything about this topic or not. When it comes to the red flag provisions and how those work, as I said, I'm not an expert in that, but I'm not opposed to any measure that enhances public safety but doesn't put people at risk of having their lives turned upside down by an anonymous reporter, right? So if somebody just off the street. So it's up to the government to strike that balance. When it comes to any of the other provisions, I mean, it's a fairly expansive bill and it's been very controversial. When else? There's a definition for assault style weapon in there, and that definition is absurd. It's just describing the guns that were already banned, and as we talked about, those guns are completely appropriate. And successive Liberal governments and Conservative governments and the RCMP have determined that those are appropriate to own for the last 35 years. So it's a difficult bill. When it comes to ghost guns, nobody wants ghost guns floating around. Licensed gun owners and the gun lobby, I'm standing here in front of you, we don't want ghost guns around at all. So we should be looking at those provisions really carefully. Regulating different firearm parts may be an answer. But I think what it is when our system apprehends someone that is trafficking in firearms or producing illegal firearms to be used in violent crime, the system has to bring everything it has to bear on that individual. We need to punish the guilty. And I think that's what gun owners are appealing for, because we're tired of being blamed for the actions of criminals. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great questions.
Please conclude this press conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Perfect.